The police lights washed my driveway in red and blue before I even shut off the generator, and in that moment I knew this wasn't about gas anymore, it was about power. 10 minutes earlier, I had been calmly topping off my truck from the old propane to gas conversion rig I'd built for emergencies, the same setup I'd shown the HOA board months ago. Now my neighbor, Karen, stood at the curb clutching her phone like a weapon, eyes blazing, already telling the officer I was stealing from community resources. She said it loudly, confidently, like truth bent itself to volume. This all started when the gas station down the road ran dry after a storm. People were tense, lines were long, and rumors flew. I stayed home, fired up my backup system, and kept my lights on. Karen noticed immediately. She always noticed. Within minutes she was at my fence, demanding to know how I had gas when the rest of us didn't. I explained, slowly, politely, that it was mine, stored legally, inspected, and approved. She didn't hear a word. She heard an insult. She told me HOA rules didn't allow private fuel operations. I reminded her our bylaws covered noise, fences, and paint colors, not emergency preparedness. She smirked and said she'd make one call and have me arrested. I laughed then, which I regret, because laughter is gasoline to people like her. She stormed off, announcing she was calling the cops for theft, fraud, and endangering the neighborhood. When the officers arrived, Karen performed. She cried, waved her arms, and insisted I was siphoning free gas from underground HOA lines that didn't exist. She said I'd threatened her, polluted the air, and violated half a dozen imaginary statutes. One officer looked confused. The other looked tired. I handed them permits, inspection reports, and photos documenting the build. Karen interrupted constantly, shouting that paperwork could be forged and that I needed to be handcuffed immediately before he runs. The moment that changed everything came when the officer asked her one simple question: where exactly did the free gas come from? Karen pointed at the ground, then at my house, then at the sky, her story collapsing under its own weight. Her voice rose, her face reddened, and she demanded my arrest anyway, because rules were rules, and she was sure she was right. I stood there quietly, generator humming, watching confidence turn into panic, knowing this was only the beginning, not the end. What Karen didn't know was that every call, complaint, and accusation she'd ever filed was documented, time-stamped, and archived, waiting patiently for the day someone would finally look closely enough to see the pattern, the lies, and the obsession behind them in clear official detail. The officer didn't arrest me that night, but Karen wasn't finished. As soon as the police cars pulled away, she pivoted, pointing a shaking finger inches from my chest, hissing that this wasn't over. Her voice had that brittle edge people get when reality refuses to cooperate. I calmly told her to leave my property. She didn't. She stood there, muttering about fines, boards, emergency meetings, and consequences. I recorded everything. The next morning, a bright orange violation notice was taped to my mailbox. According to Karen, now acting in her self-appointed role as HOA enforcer, I was operating an unauthorized energy extraction system. The wording was impressive, almost creative. She'd CC'd the entire board, 3 city departments, and somehow animal control. I emailed back with permits attached, citations highlighted, and a polite request for clarification. Karen replied within minutes, accusing me of harassment. By noon, she'd escalated. She marched door to door, telling neighbors I was stealing gas meant for emergencies and selling it on the black market. One neighbor, curious and unconvinced, asked her how. Karen snapped that she didn't need details, just enforcement. Another neighbor recorded the conversation and sent it to me with a single message: she's losing it. That afternoon, I received an email from the HOA's actual legal counsel, not Karen. They asked for a walkthrough of my system. I said yes. Karen tried to cancel it, claiming safety concerns. The lawyer overruled her. When inspection day came, Karen hovered like a storm cloud, arms crossed, interrupting every explanation. The inspector shut her down repeatedly, reminding her she wasn't an authority on engineering or law. Each correction seemed to shrink her just a little. Then the report came back. Fully compliant. No violations. No hazards. No HOA jurisdiction. The lawyer emailed the board recommending no further action. Karen responded with a multi-paragraph rant accusing everyone of corruption, favoritism, and siding with criminals. She demanded an emergency vote to remove me from the neighborhood for the common good. That's when I filed my own complaint. I submitted a packet thicker than a phone book, recordings, emails, timestamps, police call logs, and HOA correspondence showing a years-long pattern of false reports against multiple homeowners. The city acknowledged receipt. So did the HOA's insurer. 2 days later, Karen showed up again, furious, claiming I'd weaponized bureaucracy. She threatened another police call. I welcomed it. When officers arrived this time, they already knew my name. They also knew hers. One quietly asked her to step aside. She refused. They repeated the request. She screamed that I was manipulating the system and demanded my arrest for retaliation. Instead, the officer read her a warning about misuse of emergency services. The words hit her like ice water. Her confidence cracked. She tried to laugh it off, but no one laughed with her. Neighbors watched from porches, silent and observant, seeing something they'd only whispered about before now unfolding in public. Karen stormed away, but the damage was done. Authority had shifted, and she felt it slipping. The warning didn't slow Karen down, it sharpened her. By the following week, she'd reinvented herself as a martyr, telling anyone who would listen that I'd bullied the police into silencing her. She posted long rants on the neighborhood forum, cherry-picking screenshots and circling phrases in red like evidence in a trial. I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid, but because silence lets noise expose itself. Then came the certified letter. Karen had filed for an emergency HOA hearing to have my utilities shut off pending investigation. She claimed my generator was a fire risk and my fuel storage violated environmental codes. The date was set fast, too fast, and she made sure to announce it with relish, reminding everyone she'd be leading the discussion. I asked the HOA attorney whether she had authority to do that. The reply was short, no. On the night of the hearing, the community room filled up. Neighbors who'd never attended before showed up, folding chairs scraping across tile. Karen arrived early, stacking binders, arranging printouts, practicing lines under her breath. When the board called the meeting to order, she jumped in immediately, speaking over the chair, insisting time was critical because I was actively stealing free gas right now. The chair stopped her. The attorney stopped her again. I presented facts. Permits. Inspections. Letters from the city. Photos. Calm answers to direct questions. Karen interrupted constantly, accusing me of theatrics and manipulation. Each interruption was noted. Each accusation was countered with documentation. The board members exchanged looks, the kind that say a decision is forming without words. Then the attorney read aloud a summary of complaints filed from Karen's address over the past 3 years. Dozens. False alarms. Baseless accusations. Repeated warnings. The room shifted. Karen's face went pale, then flushed. She stood, shouting that she was being ambushed, that this was retaliation, that she demanded my immediate arrest for fraud. The chair banged the gavel and ordered her to sit. She refused. Security escorted her out. The door closed on her yelling, the sound muffled but unmistakable. The board voted unanimously, no action against me, and a formal censure against Karen for harassment and misuse of HOA processes. The decision would be recorded and shared with the city. As people filed out, neighbors stopped to thank me for standing up, for documenting everything, for not backing down. Outside, Karen watched from her car, eyes burning, engine idling, realizing too late that her power had depended on everyone else staying silent. And silence was gone. By morning, formal notices would travel beyond the HOA, reaching city desks where patterns matter more than volume, and consequences finally follow persistence for everyone involved going forward now. The city moved faster than Karen ever expected. Within days of the hearing, a municipal compliance officer scheduled a visit, not to inspect my property, but hers. The notice cited patterns of non-compliant reporting and interference with emergency services. Karen spun it online as proof she was being targeted for speaking out. The irony went unnoticed by her, but not by anyone else. When the officer arrived, Karen followed him step for step, narrating her own innocence, pointing at my house across the street like it was the real crime scene. The officer listened politely, then asked to see her records. She didn't have them. He asked for documentation of the gas theft she'd alleged. She produced screenshots of forum posts and her own emails. He asked for evidence. She raised her voice. Meanwhile, the HOA insurer sent a separate letter to the board. They warned that continued tolerance of frivolous complaints could raise premiums or void coverage. Names were listed. Karen's was highlighted repeatedly. The board scheduled another meeting, this time without giving her a leadership role. She showed up anyway, demanding the floor. She wasn't given it. I sat quietly, watching the dynamic reverse. Where Karen once dominated rooms, she now talked over herself, circling arguments that went nowhere. The board chair read a motion: suspension of Karen's HOA privileges pending mandatory mediation and a behavioral review. Karen laughed at first, loudly, dismissively. Then she realized no one else was laughing. She exploded. She accused me of masterminding a campaign against her, of bribing officials, of falsifying records. Each accusation dug her deeper. The attorney warned her to stop. She didn't. Security was called again. This time, she was escorted out without ceremony. The next escalation was predictable. That night, Karen called the police again. She claimed I was threatening her through coded generator noises. The dispatcher flagged the call. Officers arrived, spoke briefly with her, then with me. I handed over the latest reports. The officers issued Karen a citation for misuse of emergency services. A real one, with a fine and a court date. That citation changed everything. Neighbors stopped engaging her. The forum went quiet. Karen's posts dwindled into rambling monologues with no replies. Her confidence evaporated, replaced by frantic energy. She tried cornering me once more, demanding I drop everything. I told her communication should go through her attorney. She didn't have one. Court day arrived quietly. Karen represented herself. The judge listened patiently, then reviewed the history. Warnings. Citations. Documentation. The ruling was swift: fine upheld, probationary warning issued, and a clear statement that further abuse would carry harsher penalties. Karen stood there stunned, the script she'd rehearsed useless. As I left the courthouse, the generator at home sat unused, the crisis long over. Karen had never cared about gas. She cared about control. And she'd finally run out of fuel. You'd think that would have been the end of it, but people like Karen don't stop when they lose power. They search for another lever. A quieter one. For a few weeks after court, things were calm. Too calm. No emails. No complaints. No patrol cars slowing in front of my house. Neighbors started relaxing again, like a storm had finally passed. That's when I noticed the first odd sign: my utilities audit notice. According to the letter, an anonymous tip had claimed my home was connected illegally to municipal gas infrastructure. The wording felt familiar, almost recycled. I called the city, referenced my previous case number, and scheduled an inspection. The clerk sighed before I even finished explaining. "We know," she said. "You're not the first one tied to this caller." The inspector arrived with a tablet already loaded with notes. He checked lines, meters, seals, and logs. Everything matched. Before leaving, he quietly told me the anonymous tipper had been warned this was their final misuse report. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. 2 days later, Karen tried a new tactic. She filed a civil complaint in small claims court, accusing me of unjust enrichment for having power during the outage. Her argument was that my preparedness gave me an unfair advantage over the neighborhood. She demanded compensation. When I was served the papers, I actually laughed. Then I prepared. In court, Karen arrived with color-coded folders and a rehearsed speech. I arrived with statutes. The judge stopped her halfway through her opening statement to ask a single question: what legal duty did I violate? Karen froze. She pivoted to morality. The judge reminded her morality wasn't law. Case dismissed. With prejudice. That ruling triggered something bigger. The HOA insurer followed through on their warning. Karen's behavior had been flagged as a liability risk. She was notified that any future actions taken under HOA authority would not be covered. In plain terms, she'd be personally responsible. The board sent a final letter: step down from all committees, cease direct enforcement actions, and attend mediation if she wished to remain in good standing. Karen didn't respond. Instead, she put her house up for sale. The listing went live quietly, then spread fast. Neighbors whispered. Some felt relief. Others felt vindication. On moving day, Karen avoided eye contact, loading boxes in tense silence. As her car pulled away for the last time, there was no applause, no confrontation, just a strange collective exhale. Weeks later, a new family moved in. Friendly. Quiet. Normal. The generator stayed in the shed. The lights stayed on. And the neighborhood slowly returned to what it should have been all along. The lesson wasn't about gas or police or HOA rules. It was about documentation, patience, and the quiet power of letting truth outlast noise until noise collapses under its own weight. Life settled into a rhythm after Karen left, but the echoes of her chaos lingered longer than anyone expected. The HOA board began reviewing old cases, reopening complaints that had been rushed through under pressure. Fines were refunded. Warnings were rescinded. Apologies were issued quietly, often awkwardly, to neighbors who'd been pushed around for years. I didn't ask for any of it, but my case had cracked something open, and now sunlight was pouring in. One evening, the board chair knocked on my door. He looked exhausted, older than he had a month ago. He thanked me for my patience and asked if I'd be willing to share how I documented everything so thoroughly. I agreed, on one condition: transparency. No more shadow enforcement, no more one-person crusades. He nodded, knowing there was no other option left. At the next HOA meeting, attendance doubled. People brought notebooks. Phones recorded openly. New policies were proposed requiring written evidence, multiple reviews, and legal sign-off before any complaint could escalate. Karen's name was never mentioned, but her absence was felt in every line of the reforms. Power, once centralized in her volume, was now distributed in process. Then came the twist no one expected. A city ombudsman contacted me, asking if I'd be willing to give a formal statement. Karen's pattern of behavior hadn't ended with our neighborhood. Similar reports had surfaced in 2 previous communities. False emergency calls. Baseless accusations. Attempts to control shared resources. My documentation helped complete the picture. Months later, I received a final update. Karen had been placed on a monitored reporting status. Any future emergency calls from her would be automatically reviewed before dispatch. It wasn't punishment, the ombudsman explained, but prevention. A safeguard for everyone involved. The neighborhood changed after that. People checked in on each other during outages. Shared resources voluntarily. Prepared together instead of competing. My generator became a teaching tool, not a point of conflict. I helped 3 neighbors build legal backup systems of their own. Knowledge, it turned out, was contagious in the best way. One night, during another storm, the power flickered but stayed on. I stood at my window, watching porch lights glow up and down the street, steady and calm. No sirens. No shouting. No accusations. Just preparedness doing what it was meant to do. Karen had wanted control through fear. What replaced her was something stronger, trust built slowly, deliberately, and documented just enough to protect it. I realized then that the real victory wasn't winning against her. It was changing the system so no one like her could ever dominate it again. And that was the part no police report could ever capture, but everyone living there could finally feel. Just when it felt like the chapter was fully closed, a letter arrived with Karen's name on it again. Not from her, but about her. It came from a real estate disclosure review office, requesting confirmation of neighborhood disputes materially affecting property value. In plain terms, Karen's sale had triggered questions, and my address was listed repeatedly in her exit paperwork. Even gone, she was still trying to rewrite the story. I responded carefully, factually, attaching public records only. Citations. Rulings. HOA resolutions. No commentary. No emotion. A week later, I was informed the disclosures had been amended to reflect verified findings. Karen's narrative didn't survive contact with documentation. Again. Around the same time, a neighbor 2 houses down knocked on my door. He admitted something quietly, almost embarrassed. During the outage, Karen had offered to report him too if he didn't back her version of events. He hadn't agreed, but he hadn't spoken up either. Now he apologized. I told him the same thing I told everyone else: fear thrives in silence, but it dies fast in daylight. That conversation spread. Others came forward with similar stories. Threats. Ultimatums. Promises of protection if they sided with her. None of it had seemed actionable alone. Together, it painted a clear picture of coercion. The HOA attorney archived the statements, not for punishment, but for history. So no one could ever say, "We didn't know." A few months later, the board elections rolled around. For the first time, every seat had multiple candidates. Platforms replaced personalities. Rules replaced grudges. The new board invited a city mediator to train them on conflict resolution and authority limits. Meetings became boring in the best possible way. Then something unexpected happened. A minor gas leak occurred at the edge of the neighborhood, unrelated to me. Emergency crews responded. Streets were blocked briefly. Nobody panicked. Nobody accused. Karen wasn't there to weaponize confusion. Information flowed calmly, accurately. The situation resolved without drama. Standing there watching professionals do their jobs without interference, I realized how much energy Karen had consumed. How much attention, stress, and time had been wasted reacting to noise instead of reality. Her absence wasn't just peace. It was efficiency. Later that night, I scrolled back to the first recording I'd made, months earlier. Karen at my fence. Demanding. Certain. I almost deleted it, then stopped. Records aren't about grudges. They're about patterns. About remembering how easily authority can be mimicked by confidence, and how fragile it becomes when challenged by facts. The story people would tell later was simple: and HOA Karen called the cops over free gas and lost. The real story was deeper. It was about what happens when one person finally refuses to be intimidated, and a whole system quietly relearns how it's supposed to work. Even with Karen gone, the aftermath continued to shape the neighborhood in ways no one expected. People talk differently now, not in whispers about the crazy neighbor but openly about systems, rules, and community responsibility. It was subtle, but powerful. Conversations at block parties, garage sales, and porch chats shifted from gossip to practical discussions, emergency preparedness, shared resources, and accountability. My generator, once a point of contention, became a teaching tool. I demonstrated how to store fuel safely, how to track usage, and how to document compliance. Neighbors listened, took notes, and asked questions. Fear had turned into curiosity. Meanwhile, the HOA board continued implementing changes. A complaint submission form was standardized. Reports had to include documentation, timestamps, and evidence of prior attempts at direct resolution. Emergency calls misused in the past were now reviewed and flagged for potential abuse. Karen had indirectly forced a systemic overhaul. Ironically, her obsession with control created a community built on structure rather than intimidation. Even more striking was how the younger neighbors reacted. Teens and young adults who had witnessed Karen's tirade saw the benefits of documentation and patience firsthand. They learned that shouting and panic could never outweigh preparation and proof. Some even volunteered to help organize neighborhood safety drills. I never suggested it, they saw the logic themselves. Then came the subtle but meaningful gestures, neighbors inviting each other to share resources during minor outages, checking in on each other without fear of accusation, hosting informal meetings to discuss potential neighborhood issues before they escalated. It was quiet progress, but cumulative. Karen had tried to isolate people through fear. Instead, her actions unified us. One afternoon, I walked past the empty lot next to Karen's old house. New owners had already begun renovations. The yard was calm. No orange cones. No phone calls to the HOA. No unsolicited complaints. Just progress. For a fleeting moment, I felt a strange sense of closure, not for vengeance, not for triumph, but for normalcy restored. I realized that in all the chaos, one key lesson had emerged: control is temporary. Influence is fleeting. But accountability, patience, and clarity endure. Karen had tried to bend the neighborhood with fear, but it was facts and documentation that ultimately held the power. As the sun set over the quiet street, lights flickering on house by house, I knew one thing for certain: the neighborhood had been tested, it had survived, and it had grown stronger in ways no one, not even Karen, could have predicted. The final chapter wasn't dramatic. There were no police sirens, no shouting, no emergency calls. Instead, it was quiet, deliberate, and satisfying, the kind of ending you don't realize is powerful until you step back and see the results. Months had passed since Karen left. The neighborhood had healed, reorganized, and learned lessons the hard way. Neighbors now greeted each other with genuine smiles instead of wary nods. The HOA meetings, once battlegrounds, became forums for constructive discussion. Policies were clear. Complaints required evidence. False accusations carried consequences. Transparency replaced fear, and routine replaced chaos. What Karen had tried to destroy, the community's trust in itself, was stronger than ever. One evening, I checked the generator, ensuring everything was functioning correctly, and then walked the street. Lights flickered in houses, kids played on porches, and families chatted freely in driveways. No one watched me like I was a criminal. No one whispered about hidden threats. Everything was normal, the way it should have been all along. And yet, that normalcy felt earned, hard-won through patience, documentation, and unwavering calm in the face of chaos. Even the younger neighbors seemed changed. They approached me with questions, ideas, and suggestions for better neighborhood preparedness. They asked about safety drills, backup systems, and even how to handle confrontations without escalating. Their curiosity and diligence reminded me that lessons have a way of multiplying. Karen's obsession with control, though destructive, inadvertently created a ripple of awareness and responsibility that would last long after her departure. For my part, I reflected on what had actually mattered throughout the ordeal. It wasn't the generator, the gas, or even the threats. It was presence of mind, the quiet accumulation of facts, and letting the truth speak louder than screams. Each false accusation had been countered with evidence. Each harassment attempt had been logged and addressed through proper channels. Karen had relied on noise, volume, and intimidation. Reality relied on patience, consistency, and proof. As night fell, the neighborhood hummed with calm energy. Street lights cast steady glows on sidewalks. Families settled into their homes, and the occasional car passed quietly. I felt a sense of finality, not from punishment or revenge, but from witnessing the natural consequences of truth and accountability. The chaos Karen had introduced had dissolved, leaving only lessons, progress, and peace. In the end, the story wasn't about an HOA Karen, a generator, or a false accusation. It was about the power of standing firm, documenting carefully, and letting evidence, not volume, guide the outcome. And for anyone who had doubted that patience and clarity could overcome chaos, the neighborhood now stood as living proof. The street was quiet. The lights stayed on. And life went on.